our friends who are not able to make the call um, in real time. So we've got a pretty good number here so far. One thing is we were hopeful to have one of our friends from the Hill come on and give an update about what's going on congressionally. Jen is going to do a wonderful update for everyone, but uh, there was a vote that was called, and so they won't be able to be here. So looking forward to when they are able to join in an upcoming month. But we have a wonderful presentation on trauma-informed workplaces today. Folks are currently introducing themselves in the chat, so if you're just joining, please feel free to do this. But we are very excited to continue the work going on from the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice. Dan is calling in today, but was unable to join us via video, so just know that he sends his regards to everybody and always looks forward to these calls with everyone. There's been a lot of activity on the Hill, and so without me mumbling around anymore, I want to turn it over to Jen Kurt to talk about some of the legislative updates that we've had at the federal level, and then I will come in with some very exciting news from one state in particular before we turn it over to the main presentation with Kate Manning. And so, Jen, I turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse. For anyone who's new here, my name is Jen. I am the Director of Government Affairs at CTIPP. And so I help with their work with Congress, with our work with Congress, the federal agencies, and the White House. And I have a few updates on what's happened in Washington, D.C. over the last month since we last met. Some of it is very related to the work we do. Some of it is loosely related, but just some updates for you all. And I'm going to share my screen here. So I think it's easier to digest in a PowerPoint. How does this look? Can everyone see this? Thumbs up. Okay, great. Awesome. So for those of you who don't know, every fiscal year, Congress has to pass a budget to fund the federal government, states, programs, tribes, territories. And the budget is often considered a statement of the nation's values. And when it comes to advancing our priorities in terms of the trauma space, it's really important for us to be advocating for as much funding as possible for the programs at the federal, state, local level that help advance our cause. And so many of you were involved in one of our big priorities for this fiscal year, which was securing $1 billion for trauma-informed schools. So there's, we took some time a few months ago to call our members of Congress to include $1 billion for the pipeline and to hire more school-based mental health professionals, and also to encourage those professionals to integrate a trauma-informed approach that transforms the whole school into a more trauma-responsive entity. And so the House of Representatives, which is the chamber that originates spending bills, they released their draft in the last few weeks, and we were successful in securing that $1 billion and that language. So that is a huge win. $1 billion is no chump change. And so we really thank everyone for their help on this. We obviously have to get it through the Senate draft and in conference and passed into law. So we will continue fighting for this to be included in the final budget, but this will make a significant difference. Another priority we have is the Interagency Task Force on Trauma-Informed Care. Many of you know that SAMHSA oversees this task force, and they're developing best practices in trauma-informed care and finding ways to better leverage federal resources to support trauma-informed systems change and get those best practices out disseminated. And so we wanted last fiscal year, we got the first ever allocation of money, 1 million. This year, they're asking for 8.3 million, so we supported that ask. We ended up with 3 million in the House draft, so we're going to keep pushing for a larger number so that they can do more great work. And then thirdly, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which many of you are familiar with, we asked for 150 million. We got 150 million in the House draft, so that's really encouraging. And then the ACEs research for the CDC to do more research on adverse childhood experiences. We wanted 15 million, we got 10 million, so we'll keep pushing for a little bit more there. Recently, so since we last met, President Biden signed into law the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. This is the first gun control legislation to pass Congress and get signed into law in nearly 30 years. It was passed exactly 1 month after the mass shooting in Texas that we were discussing in our last meeting. And the process for developing and passing this bill was very insular. There wasn't a lot of opportunity to provide input because they had such a small margin in terms of trying to pass it with the number of votes that they needed. But we wanted to share some of the more specific provisions in this bill, which is now law, and we'll start to see some of these measures put in place, especially in the mental health front in the coming weeks and months. And so the gun bill sort of has two parts. It's gun laws and gun reform, and then mental health provisions in there as well. In terms of the gun reform, there was significant money to run crisis intervention programs. This includes red flag programs. This is not a mandate, but the money is to help states, to encourage them to implement them and to help them with the implementation of red flag programs, which means that, you know, when people pose a threat to themselves or others, they're sort of flagged, and there's additional securing a firearm, closing the boyfriend loophole in domestic violence law so that, you know, if you are convicted of domestic violence crimes, even if you are not married to someone at the time, even if you're just their sort of significant other, is defined as a continuous serious relationship of romantic or intimate nature, you are barred from buying a gun. It, you know, increases background checks, creates additional review processes for people aged 18 to 21 to buy a gun, and then it sort of cracks down a bit on gun trafficking as well. And so these are sort of the gun control measures that was able to get the bipartisan support that it needed to pass both chambers. And then when it comes to the mental health programs, there are some provisions in it that are really beneficial to addressing trauma. So we have 240 million for Project Aware, which includes a significant chunk for grants to increase trauma-informed care in schools. This has been a priority for CTIPP for a while, those grants specifically. There's also the CCBHCs that was created several years ago and as a demonstration program, and now that demonstration program is available to all states to participate in. CCBHCs are community-based clinics that provide mental health and substance use services free, regardless of one's ability to pay. So it really decreases those barriers. Again, more money for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which improves access to care for children and adolescents who have been exposed to traumatic events. And then 120 million to train community members and first responders on how to respond to people who are in a mental health crisis. I have a couple other things that I want to provide updates on. One is Build Back, what they're calling Build Back Mansion. Some of you may have been following last year, Democrats led by President Biden were hoping to pass major legislation that would have cost, although it was fully paid for, it had a price tag of 2.4 trillion, but it included some trauma and mental health provisions, housing, clean energy tax credits, really across many different buckets. And they wanted to pass it on reconciliation, which is a process that would only require a simple majority in the Senate, which would bypass the filibuster. But unfortunately, there was one holdout. Senator Manchin could not get on board with that package. Now that we're nearing the end of this Congress and we're looking toward the midterms, the president and Democrats are eager to try again. But Senator Manchin has to be on board, and they're trying to get him on board from the very beginning because of data coming out around inflation. He's sort of, because of that data, is saying that he is, interested in basically as small a package as possible. And so there's different rumors. I mean, it's really fluid and changes every day in terms of what he may have appetite for, but it sounds like some of the things that could be in there is prescription drug pricing, so allowing Medicare to negotiate for cheaper drug prices. And then there's this, challenge of Obamacare premium subsidies are going to face rate hikes come January, so they want to extend those. So we went from, a big package with, housing and environment and mental health and physical infrastructure down to, some of these, smaller but impactful provisions. So we're continuing to track that, and see what can come of that. Many of you already know this, that the 988 number went active last weekend. So people who are experiencing a mental health crisis can call 988 instead of the longer 1-800 number or 911. And the idea here is that people trained in mental health crisis response will be picking up the phone. And the idea is that they are better trained and equipped to handle people in mental health crisis than your usual 911 operator. The Biden administration, a lot of communities said that they perhaps don't have enough people trained to answer these phones. So the Biden administration has put a lot of money behind, beefing up these crisis centers to support the 988 system. And so now it's up and running. There have been some kinks in getting it off the ground. I think in New York City, certain zip codes, you can't call the number, or it's not directing you to the right place. And then there's been some dialogue and confusion around, will police still respond to 988 calls? And in some circumstances they will. And so, we'll see how those kinds of things get ironed out and what the response is to those things. But it is launched. I know this has been a long time coming. Some of you on this call have worked on this. So it's nice to see this cross that threshold. And then finally, many of you may have seen some of the Supreme Court decisions. Their term ended not too long ago. And so they came out with a slate of new decisions, some of them very highly anticipated. So just to go over some of them really quickly, the Biden v. Texas, the court ruled that the Biden administration is able to strike down the Remain in Mexico policy. The Trump administration, this was their policy during the pandemic that required asylum seekers from Mexico to wait in Mexico while their cases were pending. And the Biden administration struck this down. It was brought to the Supreme Court, and they sort of sided with the administration, the Biden administration. There was Oklahoma v. Castro Huerta, and this allows essentially the states to act with the federal government to preside over crimes committed by people who are not Native Americans against Native Americans on Native American country. Essentially, this sort of expands the power of states to prosecute crimes on reservations. Then we have Dobbs case, which is the one that overruled Roe v. Wade. It ruled that the Constitution does not guarantee a right to abortion. So that did overrule Roe v. Wade. Finally, the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association case, the court ruled that the New York legislation that required individuals to prove they have the need for firearm for the sake of self-protection violates the Constitution. So essentially that New York law was too restrictive of someone's right to open carry. And then finally, there was the West Virginia versus EPA case, and the court ruled that the EPA does not have the authority to mandate carbon emission reductions. And the reason why this is seen as significant on the federal level is that this has implications across many agencies and how much federal agencies can actually do without the approval of Congress. So we may see that ripple into what the Department of Health and Human Services can do, what the CDC can do based on this case. So I know a lot of these have been sort of in the news and on people's minds. So I wanted to provide that recap and just a little bit of additional information on what's been happening there. And then I'll stick around for questions, but that's the end of my presentation.
Thanks, Jen. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. The one other thing that I just want to highlight is that Jen writes a wonderful DC update every month, which I just posted the one for July in the chat. So if folks are looking to review any of the information that they just shared, please feel free to go there as well. Again, if there are any questions that folks need answered in the short term, please feel free to put them in the chat. But the one thing that I would like to uplift is that, we have seen momentum in various causes because of long-term strategy and groundswells of support, which is really what CTIPP is working to do with all of our advocates, many of whom are on this call today. And we saw some of the wins, some of the victories that have already been achieved this year because of our growing network, and there have been others in the past, but we know that there is a long way to go. And so we really encourage folks to continue to advocate on the ground as where you all are, and to help us spread the word and get more people to join our growing movement. And so in the chat, I put the link where you can sign up for the National Trauma Campaign if you haven't already. You can also see our advocacy workshop series if you haven't heard about that. And on our website, you can find a number of resources that can support continued advocacy as we build the movement to promote trauma-informed, resilience-focused, prevention-oriented, and healing-centered policies and practices broadly. Jen, I see in the chat that there's one question from Erica noticing a note about SCOTUS still using the term Indian for Native Americans. Do you know what their reason is, if any have been offered?
Well, I haven't spoken to them, but this is just what the terms that have been used to refer to these folks since the writing of the Constitution. So they just use that same language. There hasn't been any changes to the Constitution in terms of the way that these folks are referred to.
Thanks for catching that, Erica. We know that language matters a lot. So Jen, thank you again. Certainly encourage folks to sign up for monthly updates, our newsletter, and also check in for Jen's wonderful writings. Jen and Laura work really hard to provide ongoing updates as new, call outs are necessary, and as new victories emerge and as new opportunities emerge as well. And so please get involved and get others involved too, so that we can continue to coordinate and advance this very important movement. Getting into the main presentation of Kate Manning around trauma-informed workplaces, obviously there has been a lot that we've been talking about since the beginning of the pandemic around burnout and worker turnover and stress throughout the workforce. At CTIPP, we know as we build our organization that it's very hard to model the model all the time, and there is ongoing reflection and learning and processing that needs to take place. And we're so excited to have an expert like Kate here with us today. I am going to go back on my comment for one quick second. Kate, I apologize for jumping ahead in the presentation. Just wanted to uplift very quickly the fact that the state of Hawaii passed a very significant piece of legislation that creates an interagency task force around trauma-informed care through the legislature and an Office of Wellness and Resilience. And so just wanted to congratulate, first of all of our advocates in the state of Hawaii, and also recognize that the work is not just federal, but also takes place at the state and local level as well. And when we coordinate our advocacy across all levels of government, we continue to see advancement at higher and higher levels. And so just wanted to give that appropriate call out there, and missed that in my notes. So apologies there. But to what I was saying, we are very fortunate to have Kate Manning here to present to all of us today about trauma-informed workplaces. As we go through this presentation, please use the chat box with any questions that emerge throughout the content. If Kate doesn't get to them, I will keep a queue of questions in the chat that we can get to after the presentation. But Kate is the president of Blackbird DC, which provides training on empathy at work, particularly in challenging times when it matters the most. She's the author of The Empathetic Workplace, 5 Steps to a Compassionate, Calm, and Confident Response to Trauma on the Job. Kate has advised organizations on working with those in trauma for more than 25 years, including 15 years as a senior attorney advisor at the Justice Department. She worked on various cases like Bernie Madoff, the Boston Marathon bombing, and the South Carolina AME church shooting. Before her government service, Kate was an attorney in private practice representing Fortune 500 companies in class actions, insurance, and media cases. She teaches at American University and in the Masters in Trauma-Informed Leadership program at Dominican University. She graduated from Smith College and the University of Virginia School of Law. So Kate, you can update any of that information or provide any more that you want, but I turn the floor over to you. And again, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Jesse and Jen. This has been so informative already, and I've really enjoyed getting to listen in on your updates. So thank you. And thank you for the privilege of getting to address this group. It's been really fun for me to see in the chat the depth and breadth of expertise that is represented by this call. It's really an honor to be here. As you heard a little bit about my background, let me just put a little bit of context to it. So I'm a lawyer who has spent most of my career working with crime victims, started off doing domestic violence, rape crisis work, and ended up at the Justice Department where I was a senior attorney advisor on victims' rights. What I began to realize, though, was that there were similar types of supports that people needed. It sort of didn't matter what you were a victim of. If you were a victim of identity theft or human trafficking, there were certain things that everybody needed in terms of support and acknowledgement. And then I began to realize that those same types of support and acknowledgement were needed by my coworkers. If I had a coworker whose father was dying or who had an abusive boss, there were the similar types of support that were needed. But I also saw how uncommon it was that people felt comfortable supporting each other in a work environment through periods of trauma and distress. So that's when I started working on my book, and I left the Justice Department in 2019 to launch my own practice. The book came out in 2021, and in that time period is when, obviously we had the pandemic, we had George Floyd, anti-Asian hate. Over and over again, these issues of trauma were being brought to the forefront. So what I do now is I do a lot of training and consultation, a lot for government and nonprofit entities, like I think a lot of you are at, but I also work with higher ed. I work with companies, from huge banks, places like Walmart, because I think more and more people are realizing that trauma is everywhere, and that if we want to be successful in our mission, we have to learn how to get better at handling it. So the presentation that I have for you all today is one that I generally do called Trauma-Informed Leadership. I know that you are already very well versed in these, so I'm going to skip through pretty quickly a lot of the information, but I think it's helpful for you maybe just to see how I generally present it in case it's useful for you as you're making similar arguments in your organization about how to be trauma informed. So I'm going to go through all of that, but I do want this to be as helpful to you as possible. So please participate in the chat, share your own knowledge and experience, things that would be helpful based on your own background and things that you've seen, as well as any questions you have, ideas, things that come up. I want this to be as interactive as possible, so please don't hesitate at all. Okay, I am going to now share my screen so that we can just take a look at the PowerPoint. But please understand the PowerPoint is, it's there just to help our discussion. It's not there to drive the discussion. So I am totally happy completely throwing it out and just having a conversation if that's useful. So don't feel like, oh gosh, we're not getting through all the slides. I'm not worried about that. Okay. All right. So just quickly, general structure of my talk is I first start off with prevalence of trauma. I do this in part because I think it can be kind of astonishing to see all the things just lined up when we talk about all the issues that we've encountered recently. But also, I think it's an important form of acknowledgement, which is a recurring theme in my work, is the importance of acknowledging what people have gone through. So I like to start off with just an acknowledgement about everything that we've experienced over the last few years. So I start off with that prevalence of trauma. Then I go through a few definitions. I'll be curious to hear how my definitions line up with your own. And then I go through a little bit on why it's important that organizations are trauma informed, and then how to be a trauma informed leader. So without further ado, I think we can't really talk about trauma in 2022 without acknowledging the coronavirus. Over 100 Americans have died of the coronavirus at this point. And I read that for each person who has died, they leave an average of 9 family members who are grieving their loss. And that's to say nothing of friends and neighbors and coworkers. And I am sure that that includes some of you who are participating in this call. And I just want to say that I am very, very sorry for your loss. I think that the numbers have gotten so big that it can be difficult. And I think almost it feels like something we gloss over these days. And I just want to take a minute and really acknowledge that loss. And so I just wanted to start off by saying, I'm so sorry for all of the losses that we have experienced due to the coronavirus. Of course, that's not the only type of loss that we've experienced in the last few years. The economic hardship has been overwhelming for many people, 4.4% contraction in the global economy. And obviously the countries that have been hardest hit by this were the ones who had the least to begin with. Obviously, the murder of George Floyd and the spike in hate crimes that we've seen. Hate crimes are apparently at the highest rate that they've been in 12 years, according to FBI data. Here in DC, it's impossible to, I think, overstate the impact of the Capitol riots and political discord in general. Most recently, as we've seen through some of the Supreme Court cases that Jen mentioned, as well as obviously the war in Ukraine. Now, I just blew through in about a minute a whole lot of really, really challenging issues, any one of which would have been enough in a year, right? And we've seen thing after thing after thing over and over again. We've got, I didn't talk about mass shootings, Buffalo, Uvalde. It's just been again and again and again. I like to say that sometimes it seems like trauma is the air that we breathe here in the 2020s. But of course, as you all know very well, trauma is not limited to the 2020s. We've got issues of trauma that come up all the time, from things like loss of loved ones, illness, injury, racism and bias, overwhelming family obligations, alcoholism, addiction, sexual assault, and intimate partner violence. These are what I think of as the evergreen issues of trauma. They have always been there and they always will be. So one of my main goals in working with organizations is to help them see that while they may be newly aware that trauma exists in their organization due to all of the issues I've just discussed, the breadth of trauma that we're seeing, as well as the way that because of the coronavirus, we've blurred the lines between work and home. These issues have always been in our workplaces and they always will be. So what we have right now is an opportunity to decide how are we going to respond to that, and can we build organizations that are new organizations where we can have connection through trauma. Now, before I go on, let me do just a quick few definitions. First off, what is trauma? The definition of trauma I use is a I think, a sort of a streamlined and slightly more practical version of the SAMHSA definition. I define trauma as an emotional injury that affects performance and well-being. Obviously, there are many more complicated and nuanced definitions than that, and I'm not talking about physical trauma here. I'm using this definition because that's the one that works for the conversation that I am having with organizations. And what I try to focus on in particular is that trauma is not something that is caused by a certain litany list of experiences. Trauma is individual to the person. And so when we are talking about being trauma informed or helping to support employees or coworkers in trauma, we are talking about what it is that this person has experienced and what is their individual experience of it. Obviously, different people can have a very different reaction to the same experience. And just let me pause there and give you an example to put a little bit of flesh on that. So I talked to an organization that said, what we want to do is go out with a special communication to all of our employees who have lost an immediate family member to COVID. So everybody who's had an immediate family member die because of COVID, we're going to go out with a special communication to them that offers them particularized support and, you know, checks in on them. And don't you think that's a really great way to go? And I said, I really don't. I don't think that you should do that. And here's why. If you go out with that kind of communication, you are going to be both over and under inclusive. As an example, my own father died when I was in my late 20s, and I was working at a big law firm at the time. And everybody, all of my coworkers were coming up to me and saying, well, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're here. I heard your father died. I'm so sorry. This is awful. Like, just go home. Like, the reality was my father didn't raise me. I hadn't seen him since I was a small child and wasn't in communication with him. It was sad that he died, but it wasn't the same as losing somebody who was a parent who had raised you. And what was happening with this coworker response is it was just making me feel worse. Like, oh, I'm not having the right kind of reaction, or I didn't have the kind of relationship that they think I should have had with my father. It just made me feel worse. So that's the over-inclusive, but also under-inclusive, because you might have somebody in your organization, maybe the person who died for them was their ex-boyfriend who they always thought they were going to marry. And, you know, they had kind of always had this in their mind as this is their future spouse, and then he died. That can be really traumatizing for them. They're not an immediate family member, and maybe they feel kind of foolish for being as sad as they are. But the reality is that they are really struggling, and it's affecting their ability to show up at work and really in their life in the way that they need to. So the goal here is not to decide these are the types of events that cause trauma, but instead to treat the individual and assess what are they experiencing and how can we best support them. Does that make sense? Can I just give a pause and in the chat? Does this line up with what you think of as trauma? How is it the same or different? I would just love to hear some reactions to that, particularly because I know you all are so well versed in these topics.
Yes, it does. It lines up perfectly.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, good. Good. All right. So then one more definition, and that's what is trauma informed. This is the definition I use. Is a trauma informed organization is one that operates with an understanding of trauma, as well as how it is negatively affecting the employees and the communities that the organization serves. And then on top of that, works to mitigate those effects. So it's both acknowledgement, understanding of the trauma, and then taking affirmative steps to try to mitigate that. All right. So just quickly, I want to go through a few concepts. These are psychological concepts, both of them, that are really getting at this point of why it's important that organizations are trauma informed. And for that, I want to talk about institutional betrayal and psychological safety. You may have encountered these concepts before, and you know, I'm a lawyer, not a psychologist, so I'm going to give you my kind of 2 cents on these, but they're really interesting concepts, and you might want to look up more if you aren't familiar with them. Institutional betrayal is a concept that grows out of the work of Dr. Jennifer Fried, who is at the University of Oregon. The way that this concept was explained to me by somebody who worked with her is how I'm going to explain it to you. And it's to me helpful to just walk through a few hypotheticals. So first, imagine a child who has been abused by a parent. Now, there may be physical injury like bruising from that abuse, but then on top of that, there's a psychological injury from the fact that the child was injured by someone that he looks to for support and protection. That psychological injury can last much longer than the physical one. So long after that those bruises, say, fade, that psychological injury can remain. Next, I want you to imagine a college student on campus who is sexually assaulted, and she goes to her campus Title IX coordinator for support. And instead, the Title IX person kind of minimizes what she went through or implies that it was her fault. This person, obviously the student, will have an injury from the underlying assault, but now there's a second injury on top of the first that is caused by the institution's response, the response of the institution in the person of this Title IX coordinator. So that you had the injury from the assault, and now you have a second injury. For some people, they will say that second injury is worse than the first. You know, I knew that guy was a jerk, but I thought my college would stand by me. And what Dr. Fried has found is that when people are strongly aligned with an institution, and they really do look to it for support and protection in moments of need, that failure to provide that support and protection can create a long-lasting breach of trust and an additional injury for the person who was already in trauma. Is this concept resonating with you? Had you heard of institutional betrayal? And is it something that makes sense to you, that there could be a second injury that comes from the institution's response, and that institutional response can be a long-lasting one?
Yeah, this is one of the things that interrupted my life. It is very, very important.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that you have experienced that. Yeah, and thank you, Kathy. Yeah, military, most of Dr. Fried's work has been either in the military or higher ed context. And one of the things that she has found is the more closely we identify with the institution, the higher the risk of institutional betrayal. She even had one study that showed that women who were sexually assaulted while they were members of the military had worse outcomes than women of similar ages who had previously served in the military but had separated when they were assaulted. So it's fascinating that there is something in particular to the way that we look to the institutions that we align ourselves with for support and protection. I also think this, I haven't seen Dr. Fried studying this, but I think it probably also applies in church and other religious communities as well. So yeah, oh great. I hope that you all are looking at the chat. Yeah, and Abby is asking about if there are tactics to help rebuild that trust. You know, that's something I think that Dr. Fried is working on right now. Like, what are the things that can be done? One of the things that she found was really interesting, just anecdotally, was they had one woman who had been sexually assaulted while she was a college student. I think this was at her institution, the University of Oregon. At the time, the college really botched the handling, and it was an institutional betrayal. But years later, they apologized to the survivor in writing and took steps to try to mitigate the harm that they had done. And that was seen as a really healing step by that survivor. So it to me gives hope to the idea that even if the initial response is not a good one, there could still be some action taken in the future that could help. Ooh, gosh, look at this chat. You all are doing great. Really, really wonderful comments there. I hope you all know that you can save the chat. If you click on those three little buttons in the lower right corner, you can save the chat, which I would recommend because there's some phenomenal information there. Okay, so the other concept I wanted to talk about for a second is psychological safety. And I see this as the other side of the coin from institutional betrayal. So if we handle it poorly, that can lead to an institutional betrayal. But if we handle it well, that creates psychological safety. Psychological safety was largely popularized by the work of Dr. Amy Edmondson. And it's the idea that within a team or a group, it is safe to admit that you don't know the answer, or that you made a mistake, or that you're having a hard time right now. And what has been shown in numerous studies, including a sort of famous one by Google in 2016, is that psychological safety on a team is the most significant indicator of team success, that where teams have psychological safety, it enhances engagement, inclusion, creativity, well-being, loyalty, as well as overall team performance. So really astonishing effects of having psychological safety on a team. But also what the Google study found is that one of the fastest ways to build psychological safety on a team is to support each other through challenging times. When we show up for each other, when we are struggling, when we are not sure how we're going to make it through the week, the people who show up for you in those moments, that builds strong bonds of trust, and that trust becomes something that everything else can lean on. This is why I think it's so important, the ways that we are leading our organizations right now, because in a normal year, you might have, a couple of people in your organization who are going through a traumatic experience, somebody whose child is struggling or who is, trying to overcome alcoholism, something like that. But right now, as I said, it's the air we're breathing. It's all around us. And so that's why it's so particularly important, the ways that we are leading our organizations right now. Oh, great. Thank you for including those links to Dr. Fried's work. Perfect. Okay, so just a few things on how to be a trauma-informed leader. To me, there's really three overarching components to this. One is acknowledgement, and by that I mean acknowledging the trauma that exists. Two is support, providing people the support that they need. And three is trust. And by that, I really mean, are we behaving in ways that are in alignment with our values? Are we willing to take difficult steps, uncomfortable action in order to provide people with what they need in the moments that they need it most? So let me go into that a little bit more detail right now. So acknowledgement, I think of as, I will be heard. Can I trust in this organization that I will be heard? And for that, first and foremost, we have to show that we are listening. We're willing to listen to people. This is a large part of what my book is about, is active listening. How do we show people that we are listening? I know that a lot of you are very, very good at this already, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on it. But one of the things I do want to highlight is just the listening is a really, really important part, but it's not the last piece. The other thing we have to do is make sure that we are acknowledging what somebody has shared. If somebody goes through their whole story about, I just found out my brother has cancer and it's been a really rough time for our family, and you go directly into, well, I'm sure we can make it work this week. So-and-so can cover for you. So we'll figure it out. That's not going to feel great to them, right? What we have to do first, you do have to get coverage for sure. But before we do that, just acknowledge that the person has shared something difficult with you. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about your brother's cancer. I'm so sad to hear that. Thank you for sharing this with me. Just something that shows them that you heard them is really, really important. One of my favorite quotes is, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. I think so often we skip that step. We just want to jump right to problem solving. But we have to make sure that we take that step, because if we don't show people that we heard them, they really can't hear anything else we say. The next thing in terms of acknowledgement, giving people space to be heard, is just having a check-in, just making sure that we are making a regular practice of checking in on each other at work. I suggest actually making a list, which may seem silly if you only have 5 people in your organization, but the reality is that we all tend to gravitate more towards some people than others. And if we don't have the list, we are for sure going to be leaving some people out, checking in with them less often. So I would suggest just make a list and actually calendar it. Maybe you have check-ins on Friday afternoons, or you do it before you leave work every day. Just, some way to make sure that you are actually engaging in that check-in. It doesn't need to be a big deal. Just how are things going? How are you? And then actually stop and listen. I talked with one woman once who said, yeah, I'm really good at the how are you, but I realized I'm usually halfway down the hall before they've even gotten the answer out. So we have to actually pause and hear what they're saying. And then, understand there can be sometimes people will go on and maybe you don't have time for all that. It can be helpful if you say, hey, I only have about 20 minutes before my next meeting, but I just wanted to check in. We haven't talked in a while. I wanted to see how things are going. So setting the expectation at the beginning. The other getting away gracefully tip that I usually use is interrupt yourself and not them. So maybe they're telling you something about their kid's soccer tournament and you say, oh my gosh, I played soccer so much as a kid. I couldn't, oh my God, look at the time I got to run. Find a way to interrupt yourself and not them. And then finally recognize that sometimes they do need more of your time. It's not just going to be a quick check-in, and whatever it is that you have already on your agenda maybe just needs to hold off for a second because there's somebody who really needs this moment of your time, and be willing to give that to them. I am definitely an agenda person. I really, really like to tick through my to-do list, but sometimes we have to be willing to throw out the list and recognize what somebody needs from us. This is something I've been talking about a lot lately, this elephant in the room. And part of why I've been talking about it is because I did a keynote recently. I spoke at a big conference. It was a big corporate event, 650 people in a big ballroom. And everybody's in business suits. And I just started off the way that I started off this presentation, talking about COVID and George Floyd and all the things that we've experienced over the last few years. And then went on with my presentation. And to my surprise, at the end of the presentation, multiple people came up to me and told me they had cried in the presentation. I mean, people in their business suits eating their steak and Caesar salad, and they're weeping. One woman could barely talk, like her friends are on either side of her and she just kind of chokes out, I just wanted to thank you for your words. And then her friends kind of carried her away. And I just thought, what on earth happened? Like, is it something that I said or did differently? And I asked one of the organizers, what do you think caused that? And he said, honestly, I cried too. And he said, I think it's because it's the first time in 2 years that anybody just said it. And I thought, oh, like people don't feel comfortable talking at work about trauma, about the things that we are experiencing. Even people who work with trauma every day among their client population, among the communities they serve, it is much harder to recognize it in the person next in the office next door, in ourselves. So I want us all to get better at having these conversations at work. And I think that often what we struggle with is we don't want to overstep boundaries, and we're afraid that we're going to mess it up and we are going to lose control of the conversation, that people are going to be crying or yelling or something like that. So I'm just going to give you quick advice on this. I have a whole article on it that I'm happy to share if you'd like. I actually saved it in the chat, aren't I? So, or in my notes. Isn't that good? Okay, so I'm going to put it in the chat, y'all. This is the full article on it. But so in general, one is just don't be afraid to have the conversation and don't feel like you have to come in with profound things to say. What we want to do is just create space for the messy conversation. I talked with my students at Dominican University, which is a Catholic university, right after the Dobbs decision came down on abortion. I thought, we can't just not acknowledge this. We have to have the conversation. And boy, I was scared. I was like, I don't know how this is going to go. But we can't pretend that it's not there, that it's not affecting people. So let's figure out a way to talk about it. So one is easy welcome into the conversation, get everybody kind of welcome in the space in the same way that we did here in the chat. Just who are you, where are you from? Like, what did you do this weekend? Easy icebreaker. Then set the ground rules explicitly. Hey, just so you know, I wanted to have a quick conversation before we move on to the rest of our topics, where we talk about this Dobbs decision, because I know that it's on a lot of people's mind. Nobody has to share any information, but I just wanted to create room for it if people want to. We do have some other things to talk about, so let's give maybe 20 minutes to that. So ground rules at the beginning. Did you hear all those ground rules? So it was a quick shift. This is what we're talking about. This is how long we're going to talk about it. Nobody has to share anything if they don't want to, right? Then as the leader of the meeting, you have to go first. Because you are setting the tone that it is okay to talk about hard things. With my students, we talked the day after the Uvalde shooting. I was a mess. And I was clear about that. I said, listen, I just wanted to create a little room to talk about it. I'm really struggling. I said, I looked at a tweet that had images of all of those children, and I just sank to my knees and started sobbing. This is really, really hard. Through doing that, it's honest, I'm not lying, that is exactly what happened. I am also modeling that it is okay to talk about hard things, that we're allowed to talk about our feelings in this space. And then after that, ask the question. And it needs to be a specific question, like, how are you feeling? I'm sure, other people are feeling different ways. How has it been for you? And then as each person talks, acknowledge them. I haven't been able to do it. I usually try to model that through the chat, but the chat has been so fast and furious, I haven't been able to. But you want to make sure that everybody who shares something is acknowledged. Like, hey, thanks so much, Jesse, for sharing that. I'm really grateful to hear your perspective, Jen. And then finally end it well. So end with a like, hey, I just want to thank everybody for what they've shared. We've only got about a minute or two left. Is there anything else anybody wants to share? And then a final thank you. So again, I just want to pause here for a second. Do you feel like your workplace is good at talking about hard things like that, like mass shootings and Supreme Court cases? Do you feel like you all are having those conversations at work? I'm just curious because I know that you are all from organizations that are trying very hard to be trauma informed. Do you feel like you are talking about these issues with your coworkers? No. Yeah, it's too bad. Oh, good. So it looks like some of you are. Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for sharing this, you all. Yeah, and I think Chelsea's point is a good one. We talk a lot about impact on clients and patients, but not on us as a staff. I think that is very, very common for people in helping professions. We try so hard to support the people around us, but we forget that we are also humans who are having human responses as well. Oh yeah, and Alicia asking about if it's connected to human resources law. Yeah, so this is kind of like the lawyer in me. I mean, I'm not giving legal advice, but I think that sometimes people get so afraid that they are going to kind of step in it and say something terrible or get into trouble with the lawyers. If we are simply acknowledging like, yeah, it sounds like it's been really hard. I'm sorry you've had such a hard time. To me, those are not problems from a legal perspective. What might be problematic, and this is maybe a topic for a different conversation, but if somebody comes to you and says, I am being sexually harassed by Bob, and you say, well, Bob is a horrible person and we're going to fire him. Like, okay, that might be problematic because you don't actually know what happened. Maybe Bob deserves a full investigation before we make those kinds of pronouncements. But if what we are doing is simply acknowledging that somebody has come forward and shared a story of trauma with us, that doesn't seem problematic to me. Like, thanks for sharing all this with me. I'm so sorry. It sounds like it's been really hard. None of that gives me any kind of agita as a lawyer. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next topic, which is support. So this is, part of this is we need to make sure that we are providing the kind of space for people to open up, but then what happens next, right? That is a really, really crucial first step, but then there needs to be a little bit more that we are doing if we really want to be trauma-informed organization. So one is we need to have policies and procedures in place that are trauma-informed. So I did this with my students and asked them, like, what are some trauma-informed policies that you either have seen in your organizations or would love to see? So I'm going to ask you all to do that in the chat as well. They came up with phenomenal ones: mental health days, pet bereavement, which I had never thought about. But for a lot of people, I think, particularly through the pandemic, their pets were their main source of comfort, and losing a pet can be really traumatizing. Miscarriage leave, transgender policies, and intimate partner violence policies. All of these are really great policies that are supportive to people in times that can be really, really challenging. Oh, Kathy, that's a great one. I hadn't thought about that. Post-client death support. Perfect. Yeah. Yeah, Brandon, I hear you. So just some ideas for, I would just say, like, look around and see what are some things that are happening that could be supported through a change in policies or procedures. Great places for information are any kind of affinity groups or employee resource groups. They may be most aware of what some challenges are that people are having. The other thing is we have to make sure that these are not just secret policies that are sitting like on a shelf somewhere. People need to know that they are out there. So we have to talk about them widely and repeatedly. You know, an intimate partner violence policy is something I wish every organization had. Some organizations do have it, but do the people who may need it even know that it's there? Would you even think to announce it because you don't necessarily realize that there are people who are in an abusive relationship in your organization right now? The reality is that something like a third of full-time employees have been in an abusive relationship. So the chances are pretty high that there is somebody in your organization who might need a policy like that. So we have to talk about these things widely because we don't know who's going to need them. We also need to talk about them frequently. If you have some sort of EAP or mental health supports, that's great. And you may mention it maybe in January or something like that. And it doesn't click for somebody because that's not when they need it. But then a few months later, they're really struggling and they've totally forgotten that this even exists. So we need to talk about things widely and repeatedly. Yeah. So, and then let's see. Yeah, I guess I'll save that later. Okay. So the other thing I want to just mention is that in terms of support, another kind of important support that we can provide people is just information. Just as an example, a lot of organizations have been reopening lately, and there's been a lot of confusion, and they reopen and then close again, and people aren't sure how, you know, is it optional? Do you have to come back? When people are already stressed or experiencing distress, giving people more information is calming. So we want to provide as much information as we can. That's why I love this John F. Kennedy quote, because this to me resonates very much on a deep level. And in times of my life where I have felt like my world is upside down, having somebody who can explain things clearly to me and repeatedly is very, very helpful. You know, I often, when I'm talking with people in trauma, I try to say things 3 times because I have found they hear about a third of what I'm saying. So we really need to be very, very clear, speak repeatedly, and also make sure that we are remembering to tell people information, even information about what we don't know yet. Maybe we don't know when decisions are going to be made about reopening, but just letting them know, hey, decisions haven't been made yet. We want to make sure that we're keeping apprised of all of the issues that are happening with these new variants. So we will give more information next week. I don't know if we're going to have the answer at that point, but we will provide another check-in then. That's just calming, right? Don't you feel calmer just knowing, okay, there's going to be some more information coming? All right, excellent. So then I want to just talk a little bit more about how we are building trust. And again, this is largely about, can we be trusted that we are going to do the things that we say we are going to do? So are we living our values? So it is one thing to tell people that these policies are in place. But if you have mental health days that are available in the organization, but there's one supervisor who doesn't believe in them and doesn't allow people to take them, well, that's problematic, right? Like that, to me, seems like an institutional betrayal. We have one leader who is refusing to go along with our organization's values, and now we don't believe that we can trust anything about the organization's values. So we have to make sure that we are living up to what we are promising. So a few things. One is, again, clarity, trying to provide information, making sure that we are being clear about what is available and what is not available. Then we have to be consistent. So we have to actually follow through on those promises. If we are saying that this is the process for how you file a complaint of bias, then it can't be that that process is only available to some people and not others. So we have to be consistent in our application of our policies. But within that, It's also important as individual leaders that we are flexible in our expectations of others, particularly people who are in trauma. And by that, I mean, not we have different rules for different people, but more the things like be willing to throw out your agenda for the meeting if it looks like what people really need to talk about is Uvalde, right? So let's provide some flexibility as much as we can. As the organization, for instance, is making choices about reopening, let's try to provide as much flexibility as we can, and then be clear and consistent about what the rules are within that, right? So we are able to provide this kind of flexibility, but we do need to have somebody in the office every day, right? Just very, very clear. Okay. Then this is another thing that I think is important for people to remember, particularly leaders in organizations, but really everybody in organizations. We are all working in very diverse organizations where people have very different backgrounds and experiences, cultural expectations, and ways of operating and moving in the world. If we want to be trauma-informed leaders, we need to understand other people's perspectives. It's not enough just to say like, oh, I attended a training a few years ago, so I feel like I'm good on that. No, like let's commit on a regular basis that we are continually learning about others' perspectives. So just quickly, there are a lot of resources out there. If you have a new team member who maybe has a disability that you are unfamiliar with, it's a worthwhile thing to look up some information, learn what you can about that disability and the experience of those who have it and what kinds of supports they might need. You can still have that conversation with the person, you should, but come to it with some knowledge, right? Have done your own work before you enter into that conversation. There are some phenomenal books, blogs, movies, lots of great ways to learn information about others. I would love to see in the chat if you have a book or a movie or something that has really shown you a world different from your own. I would love to see it. One of my favorite books that I've read recently is it's called Know My Name by Chanel Miller. I don't know if you've read that book or seen it. Chanel Miller was sexually assaulted by a swimmer at Stanford University, and she wrote her own story about being a survivor of sexual assault in a really, really compelling and just really fascinating, really well done, beautifully written way. And I learned so much from that. So there's a whole wealth of information out there, and I think it behooves us to learn it as we are trying to support other humans in our workplace. Okay. Yeah, and thank you, Kathy, for this book recommendation. I feel like I have to go back and read Myra's comment because everybody's responding to it. I can't find it. All right. Well, maybe Myra can chime in a few minutes when I finish with the presentation and share that more broadly. Okay. The next thing is, this whole part of the presentation is about kind of walking the walk. Like, are we living our values? We can't allow breaches of our values to go unaddressed. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is we have to be willing to make ourselves vulnerable, like in the way that I talked about with the elephant in the room conversation. Are we willing to open up ourselves? It is one thing to say to people, hey, we have great mental health resources, contact EAP. They're really, really wonderful. It is another thing to say, I've used EAP myself. They were really, really supportive and helpful in a time when I really needed it. When we model that kind of accessing support, it's a lot more powerful, and it really shows people that we're not just using these words. This is something that we really, really mean. And that's how we change the culture. Okay, good, wonderful. Really great comments here in the chat. Thank you all. Good. All right. And then finally, I just want to say, like, remember that we have to take care of ourselves through all of this. I think it's been an undercurrent of the points I've been making throughout, but I was struck by these statistics that I saw recently, because these are talking about corporate C-suites, right? Which I always think of as kind of the least trauma-informed, most hard-hitting, like, kind of bottom line money focused individuals. But what this study found was that nearly 70% of them are considering quitting because they need to find a job that better supports their well-being. And a majority, 81%, said improving their well-being is now more important than advancing at work. I think that is because of what we have been seeing and experiencing over the last few years. I also think it is probably worse among leaders of government and nonprofit entities. Are you all starting to see that? Are you all starting to see turnover in your ranks as people are burned out over supporting organizations in higher need under more difficult circumstances in the last few years? Yeah. That's what I'm seeing, and what I'm hearing across the country is a lot of the nonprofits are really, really struggling right now. Oh, Casey, thanks for pointing out that book, What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah. That book, I could not believe how good it was. It's a phenomenal audiobook too. Okay. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. Teachers. Absolutely. We're seeing that in my own county as well. Okay, so just final thoughts on this. This is one of my favorite quotes. I'm sure you've seen it yourself. And I just wanted to raise it at the end as a reminder that as we are trying always to support the people around us, to be trauma informed, to support, our clients, our coworkers, our employees, remember that it's not always, we don't always have to get every single thing right. Sometimes we're going to mess up. And that's okay. Like, the reality is, if we are approaching people from a place of compassion and respect and a desire to support the humans around us, that will come through. And also remember that all of your to-do lists today, that maybe you're not going to get through because you're sitting with somebody for half an hour because their father just died, that's maybe going to be more important in the long run than all of the other things on your to-do list. So let's just try to remember to both see and acknowledge and show up for people in a human way, even when it can be difficult. Okay, so this is all of my contact information. I don't know how you use social media. So there's a lot of different ways. One of the things I've started doing recently is these Thursday texts. So I send out a text message every Thursday that's on burnout and resilience and empathy and kind of leadership issues. So I would love to have some of you, if you feel like joining me on that, that would be great. I also, let me just give you this. This is an article that I wrote on the trauma-informed workplace, just in case it goes into a little bit more detail on some of the issues that I talked about here. All right, so I'm going to stop the screen share now and give a little bit of time for conversation. So hi everybody.
Hey there. Thank you so much. Just want to invite a round of applause or snaps from those. I know that there was a lot of love going on in the chat and a lot of great activity. 2 questions so far and comments. If folks have questions, please continue to put them into the chat box. This was such a wonderful presentation. So first, Kate, because you were curious about Myra's comment, which I have an additional question to. So Myra shared that we need to think of another term other than institutional betrayal, because betrayal implies that these systems were actually set up to help certain people in the first place, which we know is not always the case. And I've heard similar notions recently that our systems are not actually broken, but are operating in the exact way that they were designed to. And so I'm just curious, and I think that we all are, sort of your thoughts on that. And Myra, thank you so much for that comment.
Yeah, thank you. That is a really interesting point, and I'm glad that you made it. I think you are 100% right that organizations are operating in exactly the way that they were designed to. It's interesting if you see the kind of evolution of Dr. Fried's work. She talks about betrayal trauma first as the kind of additional harm that comes when you are abused by somebody who is close to you as opposed to a stranger. So an assault by a family member has a different impact than an assault by a stranger, right? So, and she calls that nexus between those things, she calls that betrayal trauma. This is somebody with whom you have a trusting relationship. And so that creates a harder experience. That is a more difficult thing to heal from. So I think that's where, and then, so she does it interpersonally, and then she looked at it in terms of the institutions. And so I think that's why she's using that word betrayal, but I think it's a really good point. You know, the woman that I know best is Dr. Anne Prince, who's at the University of Denver, and she studied under Dr. Fried. She's the one who explained institutional betrayal to me, and I'm going to see her because I'm going out to Denver next week. So I'm going to raise that with her and get her thoughts on it as well. I'd be curious what she thinks.
Please let us know the answer and certainly have
Mhm.
a fun and safe trip out to Denver. The other question that we got in the chat was how do you address a situation where the workplace itself causes trauma, either directly where a person causes emotional and mental harm to you, or indirectly by witnessing mistreatment of other employees? This was sent bravely, and I appreciate this chat by someone who sent it privately because that's a current situation for them, and I'm sure others on the call or that will watch this recording.
Yeah. Um, First of all, I'm so sorry that you are going through that. I know that the people who are on this call are people who have chosen to go into a field that is about supporting and helping others in trauma. And to be walking into an environment like that without support of the organization, I think is particularly challenging, particularly awful. Um, so in terms of kind of how to handle it, right? So then your choices are, do you try to change the organization or do you try to exit the organization? And that's something I don't know that I can kind of make that call for you. I have found that when organizations learn a little bit more about trauma and understand the effect of it in their organizations on their bottom lines, that can sometimes cause some changes in organizations just on the leadership level. I've seen some shifts that have been really, really nice to see. Some of this, though, when you're talking about an individual actor, it has to be about accountability. Like the organization has to be willing to deal with abusive behavior within the organization. And if they are not, then the organizational culture is going to sour very, very quickly. And then the entire organization's mission really starts to falter. You can't serve the community if you are not taking care of the people within the organization. It will fall apart very, very quickly. So I'm sorry that you are experiencing that right now, that kind of toxic work environment. I think that it is really, really important for you to prioritize your own health and recognize that if the organization is not taking the steps that they need to address the bad behavior, if they are aware of the bad behavior and no action is being taken or actions are being taken that are kind of paper thin, not real, then I think it might be time to think about exiting that organization. I think I should say that what I am seeing right now in terms of what people are calling the great resignation or the great reshuffle is a lot of people recognizing that they have been dealing with abusive circumstances at work for a long time now, and they can't continue that it's time to make a change. I would love to hear from other people too in the chat if other people have ideas on how to handle that situation. You know, I've had similar situations in my life as well. And to me, I have found that there are some individuals who are abusive. And if the organization doesn't deal with it, they are going to continue to be abusive. There are just some people who are not going to change. And so the best thing we can do is to put boundaries between us and them.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Kate.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you again to all of our participants and the person that shared that and asked that in the chat. I think that, again, it lands with a lot of us. As folks respond to Kate's question, another question did pop up in the chat from Steve. I think leaders struggle with negotiating the boundary between accountability and being trauma informed. There's misperception that TIC is only about being nice and empathic. How do you set necessary limits in a relational way is a challenging skill. Can you speak to that?
I'm so glad you asked this question. This is something I feel very, very strongly about. So I totally agree that a lot of people think being, you know, trauma informed being nice, kind of being willing to let everybody do whatever they want. But the reality is, like, when you are allowing somebody to violate the rules or the norms of the organization, somebody is paying the price for that. If you have, maybe there's an employee at your organization who they've been having a hard year, and that means that they are not showing up at work. Either physically, like they're like literally not present, or they are not doing the work that they have been hired to do. And you think being trauma informed is just giving them some space. Okay, like that's great, but there are other coworkers who are picking up the slack for that work, right? So being trauma informed for this one person doesn't mean ignoring the needs of everybody else in the organization or the organization's clients, the organization's mission. It's important that we have both clear boundaries and we provide the flexibility that we can. Maybe this person, what they need is to be in a different role for a little while. Maybe they shouldn't be client facing for a while. And what they need is to have some other role within the organization that allows them the space that they need to heal. Maybe we are fine with the way things are, but we need to give some sort of recognition and possibly additional compensation for the people who are picking up the slack in terms of the workload. The challenge is, I think often people hide behind like, oh, I'm just being empathetic, I'm just being trauma informed, as a way to avoid having difficult conversations or taking difficult actions. To me, the hallmarks of being trauma informed are always going to be clarity and choice. Like we are very, very clear about our mission, about the parameters of what we can permit and what we can't permit. And then within that, we provide as much choice as we can. Like, listen, we have to have somebody who is on site every day. So if you are signed up to be on site and you are not there, like that can't stand. We have to address that. But maybe you don't need to be on that list of people who are on site, or maybe we schedule it in a way that works because you can, get support from somebody, a family member on that day that you need it. Provide clear expectations and then as much flexibility as you can. But yeah, thanks, Steve, for that question. It's something that I feel really, really strongly about, because I don't think it's fair to everybody else in the organization to kind of avoid these conversations. I think we have to be willing to take action. Yeah, clear is kind. Exactly. Thank you. Yeah, and it's important. It's all about boundary setting thing too. The other thing that I think about sometimes is, have you ever heard the expression, the exploding doormat? Have you ever heard that before? It's the idea that people who are kind of people pleasers will, they're just doormats, right? Like people keep kind of stepping on their boundaries, and nobody says it, they don't say anything. And so people have learned it's okay to step on this person. And then finally one person does it and they just explode, right? And it's like, you've taught everybody that this is okay to step on you. So now it's, now why are you exploding? It's really important that you are very, very clear about your boundaries and enforcing them every day. Yeah, thanks, Carrie. Other comments, questions, reactions?
I have a comment.
Great.
Okay, it was a pleasure meeting you, Katherine Manning.
Likewise.
Before this meeting, I was contemplating between RFPs and risk assessment, but from the way you started this, I saw how to do risk assessment. So now I can move on to a new area.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for your comment. Yeah, and I'm seeing Philip in the comment, the term trauma is perceived to stigmatize the person. Yeah, it's interesting. So my book, as you heard, is called The Empathetic Workplace. And the word trauma is in the subheading, but we've specifically avoided the word trauma. It's not called the trauma-informed workplace because a lot of people really have trouble with that word. Maybe we need a better word. I feel like I am often needing to define it and tell people this is what I mean when I use that word. So yeah, I don't know. To me, it's going to be interesting to see how this evolves. Yeah, and Steve, I do think you're right. I think a lot of people are conflict avoidant. It's just easier to not have the conversation because you don't want people to yell, you don't want people to cry,
Yeah. Kate, thank you so much again for all of this. There's been incredible activity in the chat, and one thing that we wanted to try for this CTIP can call that we've actually never done on a CTIP can call before was to allow for folks to engage in conversation around the presentation today. And so for folks who are willing to do a quick 10-minute breakout room, recognizing that, you know, the conversation went, that this was a rich conversation and that the call end is scheduled to end at 3:30 and folks may have to jump off at 3:30. Want to leave at least 10 minutes for some small group breakouts, just for folks to be able to converse and connect. Building relationships is so critical to this work. And so for those of you who are willing, we wanted to give this a shot and quickly just share some ground rules to hopefully create safe spaces within each of the breakout rooms, because this will be up to all of you and to sort of hold down these norms. And so we just want for everyone to know that they're invited to participate and also have the right to pass. Respect should be shown for all opinions and perspectives. The airspace should be fairly shared. We want to hear from everyone. Confidentiality should be preserved. What happens in the breakout room should stay in the breakout room. And if we report out afterward, please report out for yourself or just say, someone in the group mentioned, rather than sort of calling someone out in particular. Side conversation should be kept to a minimum. Respect should be demonstrated for the group and group process, and please feel free to come and go as you wish. And so, again, something that we wanted to try out, and the question that we wanted to ask, and feel free to sort of in your groups take this wherever you'd like to. I'm putting it in the chat now, and I just accidentally closed down the chat, clicking that, is what can we take back to the workplaces that we're in to help make it more trauma-informed from today's presentation? And wherever the conversation winds up going, that is okay. But we wanted to invite folks to engage in this conversation in breakout rooms. And so I'm going to open up the breakout rooms for about 8 minutes. I know that that's not a lot of time, but want to make sure that we're able to close that out at the 3:30 mark, and then we can engage in some longer conversation as a full group for those who are able to stick around for a bit. So hope that it's a good conversation. I'll put that question back in the chat for everybody. If there's any problems, feel free to flag us down or send a message to us. If there aren't enough folks in the breakout room, we can coordinate that and everything. But again, we just wanted to give this a trial because we know how important connection and conversation is. And after such a thought-provoking presentation, and Kate, thank you so much again, we want to make sure that you all have a chance to digest and connect and think through this with others, how we'll take this information back. And so I'm going to go ahead and open the breakout rooms now, and look forward to seeing you all in about 8 minutes. I will pause the recording.
Katherine, I could see Jesse, Katherine, us getting some of Katherine's clients perhaps to go in and do a webinar on the benefits to corporations and management of trauma-informed workplaces, such as, Katherine, what your experience has been is attendance improved, turnover decreased, that thing about presenteeism.
Connect in my organization.
I mean, how many people show up at work but are not really at work. So the benefits to the employer of a trauma-informed workplace. Do you think we could put something like that together?
I mean, just myself, I have a ton of statistics on that and I do a lot of conversations about that, but I love the idea of including a client who can come in and talk about how it helps people. I think about, I did a training recently with an organization where the woman reached out, the head of the organization, because she was like, just among our management, we've had, somebody who found out that an employee's son was suicidal, and somebody whose, mother died of COVID, and they want, like, they care about their people, they want to show up for them well, but they don't know how.
Yeah.
And they like, when that conversation happens, they get this fear, and just giving them some basic skills in how to navigate those conversations, and know that there are resources out there for them. It doesn't have to be rocket science. Just give people like some basic skills can really help a lot.
Yeah, it's humanity. And Jesse, thinking about this, it could help us with Press On in getting some corporate funding to
Yeah,
to do this.
and
We need to take it to the businesses.
yeah, and with legislators in terms of, I mean, it can help us in a number of ways. For other folks that are coming back to us, I'm curious and just ask for us to continue to keep confidentiality in mind about what others have shared.
Right.
And Laura, I see your hand up, but sort of what emerged for you through that conversation that you just had and the presentation. Laura, go ahead.
Well, sure. I thought it was really, really helpful. The two comments that stuck out in my mind, I mentioned one in the breakout room, was just the reminder to take the pause before you go into fix it mode, to acknowledge and validate what the person just told you. I thought that was really helpful because I tend to slide just straight into trying to like fix it and make it okay. And I also, one question I sort of are walking away with is there a toolkit or I guess a toolkit that exists that gives sort of like step-by-step advice and instructions for how someone can walk into their organization, whether it's their HR department or to their boss, and ask for changes in the workplace to make it more trauma-informed, empathetic, et cetera. Because I was really struck by the person's comment about how a lot of these companies, organizations, institutions are set up to function exactly the way that they're functioning now. That really resonated with some of the places I've worked with in the past. And, if you're just a regular rank and file employee, you might not have the tools or the know-how to even ask for some of these changes. So wondering if that toolkit exists, and if not, it sounds like something CTIPP should create with our partners.
I think that's a great idea. So the way that I do it is I always start off with the business case, like, let people see this is the value that they are losing by not being trauma informed. And my book, the whole beginning of it is the business case. And it's a lot on like, this is how much money we lose, for all of these different reasons. And if we bring out these issues while they're still, like in the quiet phase, I call it, like it's affecting absenteeism, but we haven't had a lawsuit yet, for instance. We maybe can avoid some of the more headline grabbing kinds of impacts. So that's generally how I do it. I don't have a toolkit. I love that idea, though, something that would be helpful. I've been trying to think along those lines myself. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, I think that we would love to partner, and I know that some others would as well, to put that together, sort of how we can advocate within our own workplaces. Want to lift up Erica's comment with a link that I just downloaded as well about stay interviews, and Phil's comment about often the costs of trauma are less to the organization and more to the persons, either as individual or other service providers. How do we raise access braid resources so they can be used to change the organization actions as well? Big questions.
Yeah.
Catherine, I know that you had a slide earlier with your contact information. I signed up for the text, but would you want to drop that somewhere?
Oh, yeah, sure. How do I do that? Let me see.
And Kate, are these slides something, or some of the slides something that we can share in a follow-up email with the network?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm just copying and pasting here into the chat.
So we'll follow up with folks that registered with those slides, the recording, and some of the resources that were shared in the chat. as well. And if you don't know if you registered or are on our listserv, feel free to message me or email me or sign up on our website. And we'll be sure to include you in that.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you, James, always. And
I failed at the pasting, so I'm just writing in. If you go to my website, you'll see all of the links, and it also has the text thing.
You know, Jesse, you might want to add in the chat box, we're talking about the bottom line costs. That World Health Organization study that found that trauma costs productivity, what, $748 billion a year in lost productivity. And that's kind of global, but it does show the cost of not having a trauma-informed environment.
absolutely, Dan. To what Dan just shared, we have a number of infographics that I will post in the chat, but one of them is specifically regarding this World Health Organization report that looked at disability-associated life years that calculated the annual cost for the United States at $748 billion in 2017 metrics. And just to put that into comparison, that same year, the entire Department of Defense budget was $738 billion. So we're talking about massive, massive, massive costs. And it is noted that they're probably conservative estimates.
And that's the cost to the employer. It's the employer that loses the productivity.
Ulysses, do you have something to comment on, or I just hear background noise?
Now, do we have any breakdowns for that kind of stuff? Because I see a lot of wasted effort, and if they were trauma informed, it would save a lot of money. But when they hear that big number, it just doesn't make any sense to them from a local standpoint.
That's the problem. I agree.
Yeah, it's not perfect.
Yeah, I usually find, I give the number, but then also share a story, that resonates for people, where, there's an example of somebody who maybe was about to leave the organization because they didn't feel comfortable talking about what their trauma was. And then once the organization went to them and talked to them about it and supported them through it, this person now has a long history with them and has been a productive employee. So to me, it's both. Like, you have to do the jaw-dropping number, but then you also have to make it a little bit more real with the story.
Yep.
There's a really timely thing going on, if you don't mind me chiming in. I know most of you don't know me. My name is Pam McNall. I run a trauma-informed character education curriculum for pre-K through 12th grade called Respectful Ways. I sit on the SEL Providers Association as a trauma-informed curriculum. And this association, this council, is a national council. And this week, I just love the serendipitous timing of it. This week is a campaign called SEL is Everybody's Business. And it is about how social emotional learning has gotten this bad rap of late in certain circles. And, what it is that it's not just us explaining that people need to have social skills, mental health awareness, but that the business sector is looking for future workforce to be able to handle perseverance, respect, responsibility. And so here, this whole conversation is about how the amount of money being lost because there's trauma in people's lives and this workforce not being able to relate, and this beautiful campaign coming out at the same time. I'm going to send an email to Jesse and Katherine with some details about this campaign going out right now. There's a big push, and we'll explain the ask, and it's right down to having CEOs as well as everyday businesses, small and large, be able to say why there needs to be emotional intelligence and trauma-informed care, mental health care in business corporate America, and how the future workforce needs to be socially and emotionally healthy. So just letting you know that this is just a neat little coincidence that this is what's happening. I love it. Nice to meet you all.
Yeah, thank you, Pam. That's awesome. I
Yeah.
love it.
Thanks
I
for
put
sharing.
some
It
info in
looks
the,
fantastic.
yeah, I put this is one little element of it in the chat, on the bottom of the chat.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Are there any other
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you.
are there any other thoughts that or comments that came out of the breakout rooms? I want to take a second to just thank you all for your participation. I know that it's a long call, and to be able to engage in conversation is valuable, and so just want to thank you for your time and commitment there as well. But any last thoughts that folks had?
There's a new chat.
I put a brief link in the chat. Dr. Janice Carello created an assessment for creating a trauma-informed program or department, and it's going to be coming out probably published in August. But there's a link to her website and the assessment, and there's also one for educators as well. And her work is really excellent.
Thank you for sharing that, Phyllis. Very much.
When it comes out this summer, could you forward it to us?
Be happy to. I'll be happy
Yeah.
to. Yeah.
Where are you, Pam? Where are you located?
We're based out of Atlanta, but it is nationwide. I have staff in schools all over the country.
Okay. Could you put your email address in the chat box so we can follow up?
Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. Pam at respectfulways.com.
Thanks, Pam.
Thank you.
And again, just want to thank everyone on the call. Kate, after such a wonderful presentation, I'm curious if you have any last thoughts for the group.
I think mostly I just wanted to thank everybody for persevering in this work. I know it's not easy, particularly in the last few years. I have seen again and again folks who do this work getting more burned out and disengaged. And the ways that you all have shown up on this call make me realize that you are doing phenomenal work in your communities. And I just wanted to thank you for that and for kind of taking care of yourself enough that you're able to keep doing this work.
Thanks, Kate. And same to you. Thank you again for being with us, and to everyone on the call, especially those still on the call. Thank you so much for being with us. Next month, we're going to have, for our August CTIPP CAN call, it'll be Dan sort of talking a lot about sort of what got him into trauma-informed advocacy and where he sees the future of this work going. And we'll have some other exciting legislative updates for you all then. But for the meantime, over the course of the next month, please take care of yourselves. Be safe and well. Reach out if you ever have any questions. Keep working, and we'll keep building this movement to continue to affect change. And just a big, heartfelt thank you for the great work you all do, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.